The night didn't start as anything extraordinary. Hudson and I sat in his apartment, nursing beers that had long since gone lukewarm. The drone of the city outside his window was a distant rhythm, a backdrop to our laughter as we swapped stories from high school, exaggerating the absurdities and downplaying the heartbreaks. Hudson leaned back against the worn leather couch, his legs sprawled out like he owned the space around him. He always carried himself like that, effortless, unbothered. It was maddening how he could fill a room without even trying. I, on the other hand, had spent years perfecting the art of blending into the background, the quiet observer in our duo. But tonight felt different, like there was something unspoken simmering between us, just beneath the surface. Maybe it was the alcohol loosening the edges of my restraint. Or maybe it was the way Hudson's laugh lingered longer than usual, the sound warm and rich in a way that twisted something deep inside me. Somewhere between the jokes and the memories, the weight of my secret grew unbearable. I could feel the words clawing their way out, desperate to escape. Before I could stop myself, they tumbled out into the open. "I'm in love with you." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. Hudson froze, his beer halfway to his lips, his eyes wide with something that looked like shock. And then, as if on cue, he laughed, a nervous, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, man. You're drunk," he said, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. I forced a laugh in return, but it felt brittle, like it might shatter if I wasn't careful. "Yeah, you're probably right," I said, even though I knew I wasn't. The tension in the room was palpable, an unspoken wall that neither of us dared to acknowledge. Hudson didn't press, and I didn't offer any further explanation. But as the minutes ticked by, the laughter that had once come so easily now felt forced, like we were both trying too hard to pretend nothing had changed. That night, I barely slept. I lay on the couch in his living room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. I told myself that by morning, things would go back to normal. Hudson would shrug it off, and we'd pretend it never happened. But when I woke up to the sound of him moving around the kitchen, the easy flow of our friendship was gone. There was something different in the air now, a strange tension that neither of us knew how to navigate. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice too casual, like he was trying to fill the void with small talk. "Yeah." "Thanks," I replied, my throat dry and scratchy. He handed me a mug without meeting my eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in his presence. The days that followed my confession blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Hudson was no longer the guy I knew, the guy who could read my thoughts with just a glance, who knew how to pull me out of my worst moods with a stupid joke or a well-timed smirk. He answered my texts, but each reply felt like an obligation. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now sputtered out, dying under the weight of things unsaid. When we hung out, the silence was the worst part. It wasn't the comfortable quiet we used to share, the kind where words weren't necessary because we already understood each other. No, this was a different kind of silence, awkward, oppressive, as if every unspoken word between us was choking the air out of the room. I replayed that night over and over in my mind, dissecting every second, every word, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I'd gone too far. Maybe it was my tone, or the look in my eyes, or the fact that I'd said it at all. I tried to convince myself that I hadn't ruined everything, but the evidence was piling up against me. One night, when the weight of it all became too much to bear, I called him. The phone rang and rang, each tone echoing like a cruel reminder of how things had changed. When it went to voicemail, I told myself he was probably busy, but deep down I knew better. Hudson had never ignored my calls before. The distance between us was unbearable, but I told myself to give him time. Maybe he needed space to process, to figure out how to reconcile the old version of me, the one he thought he knew, with this new, unfiltered truth. But patience wasn't easy, especially when I learned he was dating someone new. She was gorgeous, with an effortless charm that seemed to draw people in wherever she went. I saw them together once, laughing over coffee at the cafe we used to go to. She touched his arm as she spoke, and he smiled at her in that soft, easy way that used to be reserved for me. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I told myself I had no right to feel jealous, no right to expect anything from him. But every time I saw them together, it felt like someone was twisting a knife in my chest, reminding me that I'd already lost him. I tried to focus on other things, work, hobbies, friends, but nothing could fill the void Hudson left behind. The thought of him moving on while I was still stuck, still tethered to that moment of raw vulnerability, was unbearable. Was this it? Was this the end of us? One night, as I lay awake in my empty apartment, staring at the ceiling, the question echoed in my mind: had I lost him forever? The night it happened wasn't supposed to be special. Hudson had invited me over to watch a movie, something mindless and loud that neither of us would pay much attention to. But even as I walked into his apartment, I could feel the tension lingering between us, an unspoken weight that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. We tried to talk, tried to laugh, but the air felt thick with everything left unsaid. Every glance lingered too long. Every word felt loaded. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We'd spent years building a friendship so easy, so effortless. But now, it was like we didn't even know how to be in the same room without stumbling over the distance between us. The breaking point came out of nowhere. We'd been arguing, not really arguing, more like snapping at each other over something inconsequential. I can't even remember what sparked it. A comment about the movie? A sarcastic jab? It didn't matter. What mattered was the way the frustration boiled over, spilling out in sharp words and clipped tones. "I don't get it, Hudson," I said, my voice rising. "What the hell are we even doing? Because this thing between us, it's killing me." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something raw in his eyes. Anger, confusion, fear. Maybe all of it. "You think this is easy for me?" he shot back. "You think I don't feel—" He cut himself off, his jaw tightening as he turned away. "Feel what?" I demanded, stepping closer. "What, Hudson? What don't you feel?" He didn't answer, and the silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I thought he was going to shut me out again, retreat into that wall he'd built around himself. But then suddenly he turned, and before I could say another word, his hands were on my face, pulling me closer. The kiss was a shock, like the air being knocked out of my lungs. His lips were warm, firm, and insistent, and for a moment I couldn't move. My brain couldn't catch up with what was happening, and just as quickly as it started, it was over. Hudson pulled back, his hands dropping to his sides as if he'd been burned. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "That was a mistake," he said. I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice trembling. He nodded, taking a step back. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Don't," I said, cutting him off. "Don't apologize. Not for that." He looked at me then, his expression a mix of fear and longing. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I'm so confused. And it scares the hell out of me." My chest tightened at his words, but I refused to let him pull away again. I stepped closer, closing the distance he'd tried to create. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," I said softly. "But don't run from this. Don't run from me." For a moment, I thought he might lean in again, that he might let himself feel what I'd seen in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, he shook his head and backed away. "I can't do this," he muttered, grabbing his keys from the counter. Before I could say anything else, he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. I stood there in the silence, my lips still tingling from the kiss, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Was it just a moment of weakness? Or was it something more? I didn't know. All I knew was that nothing between us would ever be the same again. Hudson's call came late at night, his voice quiet and strained. "Can we talk?" he asked, and I knew immediately what he meant. We met the next evening at our usual spot, the small park where we'd spent countless afternoons as kids, running through the grass and sharing secrets under the shade of the massive oak tree. It was strange how something so familiar could feel so foreign now. Hudson was already there when I arrived, sitting on one of the weathered benches near the duck pond. His hands were clasped together, his head bowed like he was praying or bracing himself. As I approached, he looked up, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow. "Hey," I said, my voice tentative, unsure of where this was going. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. The air between us was heavy with unsaid words, but I didn't push. I waited for him to speak, watching as he struggled to find the right ones. "I've been a mess, Preston," he finally said, his voice low. "Since that night, I can't stop thinking about it. About you." I held my breath, afraid to say anything that might shatter this fragile moment. "I've always thought of you as my best friend," he continued, his gaze fixed on the pond. "But lately it's been more than that. I just never let myself, go there. I didn't think I was allowed to." His words hit me like a freight train, the confession I'd never dared to hope for finally tumbling out into the open. "Hudson," I began, but he cut me off. "Let me finish," he said, turning to face me. His eyes were bright, intense. "You're the one who gets me, Preston. You've always been the one." I just didn't realize how much that meant until now. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I wanted to reach for him, to pull him close, and tell him everything I'd kept bottled up for so long. But then he said it, the thing that made my heart sink. "I don't know what this means or what to do with it," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But I'm still with Rachel. I can't just walk away from her." Rachel. Her name felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of the obstacle that stood between us. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "So what are you saying, Hudson? That this, whatever this is, doesn't matter?" "No," he said quickly, his eyes pleading. "It does matter. You matter. But I'm scared, Preston. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be this." I stood up then, unable to sit still any longer. I paced a few steps away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process his words. "You think I'm not scared too?" I asked, my voice rising. "You think this is easy for me? I've loved you for as long as I can remember, Hudson. And now you're telling me you feel the same, but you're too afraid to do anything about it." He stood as well, closing the distance between us. "It's not that simple," he shot back. "Rachel, she's done nothing wrong. She doesn't deserve this. And what about me?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Do I deserve to keep waiting for you to figure this out while you stay with someone you don't even love the way you love me?" The words hung in the air between us, raw and unfiltered. Hudson looked at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but instead he turned away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so softly I almost didn't hear it. I watched as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the park. My heart ached with every step he took, but I didn't call out to him. I couldn't, because as much as I wanted him, I couldn't force him to choose me. As I stood there alone under the fading light of the evening, I realized something that both terrified and freed me. Love wasn't always enough to fix things. Sometimes it only made the cracks more visible. But even then, I couldn't let go of the hope that maybe, just maybe, Hudson would find his way back to me. The months that followed were a blur. Every time I saw him, I could feel the weight of our unspoken feelings. It was suffocating. Hudson kept seeing Rachel, and I tried to convince myself that it was fine, that maybe I could just stay in the background, remain his friend, even if it was tearing me apart inside. But one day, I couldn't take it anymore. Hudson came to me, looking different, more tired than I'd ever seen him. "I'm leaving," he said. "I've been offered a job in another city." His eyes were filled with regret, but also something else, something softer. "I need to figure things out, Preston. I can't keep pretending like I don't feel anything for you." And then it hit me. He wasn't running away from me. He was running toward something we had both been too scared to face.